Tonight on Talking Politics, Governor Maura Healey's pick to head up her new Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities gets some pushback. Plus, proposals to make undocumented immigrants living in Massachusetts eligible for in-state tuition at state colleges and universities are gaining momentum on Beacon Hill. But first, Rachael Rollins has resigned as U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts after federal investigators released 2 scathing reports detailing a slew of ethical failures over her year and a half in office. Most notably, after 2 separate investigations, the Justice Department Inspector General and the Office of Special Counsel found that Rollins tried to influence the election to replace her as Suffolk County DA. She fed the press damaging details about one candidate, then acting DA Kevin Hayden, including sensitive DOJ info. She acted as a political advisor to the other candidate, Boston City Councilor Ricardo Arroyo, and she lied under oath about what she'd done. Investigators also cited several other transgressions, including inappropriate attendance at political events, soliciting free Celtics tickets, and getting outside parties to cover personal travel costs. The special counsel called some of the now former U.S. attorney's actions, quote, among the most egregious transgressions of the Hatch Act they'd ever investigated. That act bars federal employees from engaging in political activities, partisan political activities, while on the job. Rollins' resignation seems to rule out any additional penalties from the government as discipline for her Hatch Act violations, but the political consequences are just beginning to come into focus. Joining me to talk it through are GBH News senior investigative reporter Phillip Martin and Abdallah Fayyad, opinion writer and editorial board member at the Boston Globe. Before I start, we should note that GBH News legal analyst Daniel Medwed was referenced in the Department of Justice report on Rollins. Medwed has been suspended as an analyst pending further review. Thank you both for being here. Phillip, as someone who's covered Rachael Rollins for years, what was your reaction when you read through these 2 reports when they popped?
Well, it was surprise. I think, like a lot of people, I was shocked. And here's the reason why. I think there were expectations because of the leaked information earlier regarding her attendance at a fundraiser for Jill Biden last summer. And that was a clear violation of the Hatch Act. We had understood that she had gone inside as opposed to greeting Jill Biden outside, which would have not led perhaps to a violation. Yeah. The fact that she went inside, the fact that she took part in a fundraiser, that was seen as problematic. So I expected some type of reprimand. I did not expect this wide-ranging report about Kevin Hayden and the role that she played in trying to secure his election.
Yeah, and I got to say, when I was surprised as well. And the detail, in particular in the Department of Justice report, it was so intense, the texture, it was so rich and so damning that was part of my surprise.
Well, that's true, and I should say to subvert his election, my apologies, not to secure his election.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Regarding Kevin Hayden and her working on behalf, as the report said, essentially working as a campaign manager for Phillip.
Thanks for catching that, because I should have.
For Ricardo Arroyo.
I didn't. Abdallah, in the editorial that the Globe put out about moving forward in the wake of these reports, you suggested that Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey should basically steer clear of the process, trying to come up with Rollins' successor. They had recommended her, and the Globe editorial page says, you know, they should keep their distance this time around. Why is that?
Part of the reason is because, you know, both reports outlined an extraordinary abuse of power that was overtly political. Rachael Rollins had used the office of the U.S. Attorney to influence a political election. The DOJ has to act as an apolitical department, one that pursues justice without fear or favor. We cannot have a Department of Justice that acts political in any way. And so in order to clean up that office after what happened under Rachael Rollins in these reports, the Department of Justice and President Biden in particular has to make sure that her successor is as apolitical and fair as possible. Is not somebody who is coming up through the political ranks, but somebody who is respected, somebody who is apolitical, somebody who is as independent as possible. That's the kind of reasoning behind that.
Is there implicit in that recommendation a suggestion that Markey and Warren missed cues about Rollins when they pushed for her nomination in the first place that they should have caught?
You know, that's a good question, and I think, you know, they have to answer you know, that question at some point in a real way. You know, it's hard to say at this point what their lapse of judgment here was, because the reality is Rachael Rollins was a qualified candidate to be U.S. attorney. She was the district attorney. She had a good record as district attorney as far as we can tell. And the reality is, as Senator Markey, said, she was vetted by the White House. The FBI does a background investigation on candidates for U.S. attorney, as does the DOJ. And, if they didn't turn anything up then, her qualifications, her resume made her a candidate for a U.S. attorney. So, it's hard to say that they had, serious lapses of judgment there without knowing the full story, but it's certainly a question that needs to be answered.
Phillip, what, if anything, are Rollins' most passionate supporters saying in the wake of these findings? Are you hearing support, continued support for her, people perhaps suggesting she's getting an unfair deal from the federal government or an unfair shake? Or is there frustration with Rollins, anger at her for having this opportunity, moving into this incredibly important role and then blowing it, as far as we can tell?
Well, I think it's both. I think you're hearing from, and I have spoken to a number of her supporters, interestingly, few who want to talk on the record, but you do find continued support for Rollins because they believe she is essentially principled, though they also are concerned that what she did was indeed unethical. So you have those who support Rollins because she is a principled progressive, but they certainly don't agree with the Tom Cottons of the world,
right,
who basically are attacking her progressivism,
right,
not her. But they are concerned that she blew it. I think the term that Kevin Cullen used in the Globe was hubris, and that is what you're hearing on behalf of some of her supporters. But you do continue to find people who are, in fact, who find that she is essentially a principled individual who took it too far in trying to basically hold on to her legacy with the district attorney's office, feeling that Kevin Hayden, they felt, might have jettisoned some of those reforms that had been instituted.
I know that whatever, we all have different opinions. We're all subjective human beings. But if you actually spend the time to read those reports, the idea that she just took it too far, as you have mentioned at the outset, there are just so many richly detailed transgressions in here. It seems to defy easy dismissal to me, but that's just my take as one observer.
Well, that's just it. It can't be dismissed, and her supporters aren't saying these things should be dismissed. They find that what she did was extremely problematic.
Okay, thank you for that.
But they also find that this does not in any way give credence to the declarations by right-wing Republicans, such as Tom Cotton, that she was unqualified. The very point that Abdallah made is absolutely correct. There's a difference between being unqualified, and you had a vetting commission process that deemed her as a qualified candidate, but also found that she engaged in behavior that can only be described as hubris.
Abdallah, the Globe editorial points out, I think quite appropriately, that there's no necessary connection between her approach to criminal justice, her progressive approach, and her transgressions while she was U.S. attorney. But it seems to me that people are likely to form that association, rightly or wrongly. Do you think that it's going to make it harder on the heels of this, or do you think what Rollins did will make it harder in the future for people who approach criminal justice the way she did to be elected to DA positions, for example?
I really think it shouldn't, and I don't think it will. And part of the reason is because Rollins herself was a deeply flawed individual to hold this office. She was far too political, and what she did, was her own doing. There's no one else to blame but herself. What she was doing was clearly, unethical. Some of her conduct not only just bordered but crossed the threshold of criminal, lying under oath. She knows that. She's a lawyer. No one forced her to do any of this stuff. No one forced her to use the office of U.S. attorney to influence an election. She knew it was wrong. That was her doing. That does not at all reflect her legacy on criminal justice reform as the district attorney. Doesn't at all influence, the policies that she put in place. Other district attorneys or the progressive prosecutors in the country. Doesn't impact the work that they're doing. It doesn't impact criminal justice reform activists. It is just reflective of an individual who violated her code of conduct and potentially committed criminal conduct as well.
Phillip, do you agree with Abdallah's take there?
I think what's happening, though, I think the conservatives will stitch this as part of the fabric that they are sewing against progressive DAs and U.S. attorneys across the country. So I think that this is not a separate incident in the minds of right-wing Republicans. It will be used politically. It will be used as an example of what happens in the same way that Krasner is being used in Philadelphia, Garcon is being used, the district attorney in Los Angeles, and you find a similar situation in St. Louis, where the DA, progressive DA, has been forced out. The whole notion of a progressive DA and progressive law enforcement is under assault. Rachael Rollins will become example A in as a U.S. attorney, someone who is supposed to be apolitical in that assault on progressive criminal reform legislation, justice, and district attorneys across the country.
Closing question for both of you. When Ricardo Arroyo, who was the candidate, candidate Rachael Rollins, wanted to see elected to replace her, when he was interviewed a day or two ago, he said, among other things, you know, there were leaks in this race that damaged me, and I'd like to see them investigated. Let's take a look at how he put it.
I'll say that this particular campaign suffered from a number of illegal leaks from different directions. Certainly the reports that were leaked 2 weeks before an election that have not been investigated into where those leaks came from. There's been a number of things that I would say in that particular case specifically that I'm aware of that I find considerably problematic and that I do hope are fully under investigation.
These would be leaks involving past allegations of sexual assault against him. Really quickly, does he have a point here? Now that we know one side of the story, what happened behind the scenes, should we know the full thing? And do you think we will?
Well, I think everything should be revealed. Yeah. There should be no secrets at this point. This should be everything involving this situation in his election should be revealed. But I can also tell you that I think he's hurt by this tremendously. No matter how this turns out. All
right, Abdallah, you got the last word.
I agree entirely. I mean, I think these two reports open up a lot of questions about the conduct of a whole host of public officials. You know, the district attorney, Kevin Hayden, also had questionable conduct during that election. And, you know, while that's not outlined in this report, you know, that's something that should be investigated.
It makes you want to learn more.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. All right, Abdallah, Fayyad, Phillip, Martin, thank you both.
Thank you, Adam.
Next up, back when Maura Healey was running for governor, she promised that if elected, she'd create a new cabinet-level Secretary of Housing position to help deal with one of the most pressing challenges facing the state. And this week, she announced her pick, Ed Augustus, a former state senator and city manager of Worcester. On Thursday, at an affordable housing event in Lowell, Augustus described how he plans to approach his new job.
Lots of folks here today and over the last few days have asked me, you know, what's driving your work? And it's really two words: more, faster. That's what it's about. We need to do everything we can to get more of these projects underway. That has to be our urgent task, and that has been the charge I've received from the governor.
But after the Augustus hire was announced, some housing activists raised questions about whether he's really the right person for the job. Concerns detailed in the story by my GBH News colleague, Sam Turkin, who joins me now. Sam, thank you for being here. Who is concerned about the Ed Augustus pick, and why are they concerned about it?
Hey, Adam. So, yeah, housing advocates based in Worcester and really statewide housing advocates were surprised by the pick. One, because they were expecting somebody with a little bit more housing expertise, and Augustus just does not come from that background. He was the city manager in Worcester from 2014 to 2022, and in Worcester, city manager runs the city. And granted, he oversaw the revitalization of Worcester during his time. He brought in a lot of developers to build, and thousands of housing units were built while he was city manager. But what housing advocates say is the vast majority of those units were high-end luxury market rate units that weren't affordable for a lot of people who live in Worcester. And they did not do anything to help address Worcester's growing affordability crisis. In fact, while Augustus was city manager, rental prices rose to record highs, homelessness rose to record highs. So these advocates were a bit puzzled when the governor selected him to do something like reducing housing costs and building more housing, when he didn't necessarily do that in Worcester.
One of the advocates that you talked to, Andrea Park from the Mass Law Reform Institute, who we've had on the show, she raised questions about what this tells us about Healey's broader approach to the issue, right? Her concern is that maybe the Healey administration is just going to be locked in on building, period, as opposed to building affordable units that the most economically vulnerable people can afford to live in. Am I getting that right?
Right, and there is a difference, because just because you are building doesn't mean you are addressing the affordability crisis. There are differing opinions on this, that if you increase supply, you're naturally causing prices to go down. The thing is, in some cases, if you increase supply by building just high-end, expensive housing, you're not doing much for the people at the lower end of the ladder who can't afford that housing. So Worcester is the case study. Worcester saw that happen. Worcester has seen this boom in high-end housing, but again, it's done nothing for people at the lower end of the spectrum.
I should probably mention, or give you a chance to talk about, you quoted one housing activist who was pretty bullish on the Augustus pick, right? Who was that?
Yeah, his name's Addison Turner. He's based in Worcester, and he advocates for homeless people here. And what he said was, I mean, he was very stark with what he said. He said, look, gentrification increased in Worcester under Augustus.
Oh, forgive me. I'm sorry to interrupt. I wanted to refer to, he was very down on the Augustus pick, but there was someone you talked to who was positive about it, correct? Or someone you quoted?
Oh, yes, Rachael Heller. I did not speak to her specifically, but she was publicly congratulating Augustus, and she was a member of the governor's transition team, and she seemed to be happy with the selection. And I'll say other housing organizations here in Worcester were hesitant to criticize the pick, because they didn't want to jeopardize any connections and burn any bridges by criticizing the selection.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that's, when you're dependent on an administrator or an entity as powerful as a gubernatorial administration, you got to choose your words carefully. Sam Turkin, I have to leave it here with you, but let's get you back sometime soon to talk more about Worcester-based politics. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Finally, tonight, when it comes to national politics, immigration, and the question of what rights to grant undocumented immigrants are flashpoints that yield plenty of conflict, but not much in terms of solutions. Lately, here in Massachusetts, however, the picture has been different. Last year, voters passed a ballot question that will let men and women without legal status get driver's licenses if they can provide proof of identity and residence and complete the requisite testing. And now a push to let immigrants without permanent legal status pay in-state tuition at public colleges and universities seems to be gaining some momentum on Beacon Hill, with support from the state Senate, Governor Maura Healey, and some big stakeholders in the world of higher ed. So what exactly is the rationale for that change? What are the arguments against it? And how likely is it to become law when negotiations between the Senate, the governor, and the Massachusetts House have run their course? Joining me to discuss are State Senator Liz Miranda, who's filed separate legislation to make in-state tuition for undocumented students a reality, and reporter Jennifer Smith of Commonwealth Magazine. She's been covering the push as it moves forward. Good to see you both. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
Senator, your plan, if I understand it correctly, is similar to the plan that's contained in the Senate budget. What are the details people should know about?
So the folks should know, first, we want to thank Senate President Spilka and Chairman of Ways and Means, Michael Rodriguez. My predecessor, Sonia Chang Diaz, worked on this a lot. Mira has been pushing this bill, and that's why we filed it. And Senator Creighton has been working with me on this similar bill. 1 in 6 people in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts are foreign-born. We have over 14,000 young people between the ages of 3 and 17 that will be graduating from our mostly public school system who are undocumented. There are already 12,000 students in our community college and college system that are already undocumented. This is about in-state tuition. It is very expensive to go to college. And we know that DACA students, TPS students already have access to be able to get in-state tuition, which is nearly half of what it costs for someone out of state. For an example, 23 states and the District of Columbia Columbia have already passed legislation like this, and we're falling behind. This is not only a moral imperative, but I think practical for equity and inclusion and for student success.
All right, you anticipated my next question, which was going to be what's the rationale for this? So talk me through the details. To get in-state tuition, if this plan becomes a reality, what would you need to do? Because if I understand correctly, there's requirements about how much time you spent in a Massachusetts high school. So what are they?
So the first requirement is have you spent 3 years or more in a Massachusetts public school? The second, can you show a valid Social Security number or a taxpayer ID? The third and fourth are pretty similar. Can you show an affidavit that you're actually going through the process of getting your immigrant status closer to what we need in terms of being a lawful citizen or permanent resident of the Commonwealth? Or have you signed up for service? I can give you an example of a student. I'll call him William. He worked on my campaign. He was a great young man, stellar student at the community college system, and he was about to go into a state institution. And when he was going to apply, they could not offer him in-state tuition. But he had already gone through the immigration steps. But because of COVID-19, there are 2-3 year backlogs on getting his renewed green card, and that actually stopped him from being able to afford UMass Boston. And so now he's in Utah at Brigham Young. But if we could keep that young man here with the in-state tuition, this is why we're pushing so hard for this.
Thanks for that example. Just to be clear, he was not a DACA recipient, right? You said
no,
DACA recipients already get in-state tuition? Okay. Jen Smith, I actually learned that this was a burgeoning issue from reading your piece in Commonwealth, which I think came out maybe like a week and a half before the Senate released their budget. So great job getting ahead of the news cycle. You reported on a panel that was talking about this issue at the Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate. Were the arguments being made there the same as the ones that Senator Miranda just made, or were there different rationales being offered?
It's very similar. These have been a lot of the same folks who have been pushing for it over the years. So you have education leaders who are essentially saying, we're not servicing the students who are already here. The arguments are essentially saying, we don't want to penalize people who have otherwise demonstrated a connection to the state and an interest in participating in our education system and key workforce just because they happen to not be documented coming into it. So many of the same arguments were made. I believe people might hear a ring of Beacon Hill's favorite buzzword in the way that the conversation has been conducted. Do you want to guess at it?
I'm going to guess competitiveness.
It is competitiveness. So it's not just that the education leaders are saying that there's kind of a humane reason to be pushing for it, but this has also very much become a workforce issue.
You know, as you mentioned that, it reminds me of when the driver's license issue played out. I remember when that was passed, watching House Speaker Ron Mariano address the advocates who've been pushing for it, and he praised them for reframing the arguments that they made for that, turning it into a public safety issue as opposed to a fairness issue. So it sounds like something similar might be going on here.
Comparison.
Am I remembering right that Jim Rooney from the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce was at the panel that you covered, or am I getting that wrong?
He wasn't at the panel. I did talk to him afterward because the panel was focused on education leaders and immigration officials, and you have to know, well, some of them mentioned the workforce component to it, and Jim Rooney, of course, is the person you go to if you want to know how the business community feels about a workforce argument.
And he was positive, right?
He is. He basically said his initial concerns were if it was kind of just a blanket offer, he'd have some quibbles, but given the specific restrictions and given kind of the emphasis on keeping the people who are already here, he said this seems to make a lot of sense, and they are, of course, dealing with really serious workforce shortages across sectors.
I want to ask you both if there are arguments that are percolating that you're hearing that are being made against this proposal. Is there anything out there?
I haven't really heard anything, but I want to say two things based on what Jennifer said. We've been hearing a lot about competitiveness, and I've been shifting the conversation on Beacon Hill that it's more about belonging. These young people are already here. They're in our public school systems disproportionately. When we think about the workforce challenges, COVID-19 taught us something, and we can't go back to normal because normal wasn't good enough. So I haven't heard any, but there are some people that are pushing on the anti-immigrant movement that these laws are archaic, but that comes from the federal level. If we're going to compete and we're going to make sure people know that they belong in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Massachusetts is one of the top 15 states where there are underdocumented and undocumented families. And they're already here, they're working, going to school, playing, they're serving us, they're our teachers. And so we want to make sure if community colleges and in-state institutions are the place where hope and opportunity live, we want everyone in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to have the same hope and opportunity.
Jen, are you hearing any arguments being advanced against this, even quietly?
So I think one of the things that Senator Miranda points to correctly is that the objections to this are in line with kind of broader objections to the idea of incentivizing in some way people to be coming to the country because they will have opportunities to, in the driver's license situation, be able to drive and be, licensed even if they aren't documented. And in this case, most of the objections have focused again around the idea of encouraging people to come here, which, if that's your position, you feel is counter to the purposes of the immigration system.
All right, tell me if I've got this right. Michael Rodrigues, who you mentioned earlier, the Senate Ways and Means Chair, he headed off one possible argument against this, or at least made a move in that direction by saying when the Senate budget was rolled out that based on the projections he is seeing, this would actually be a money maker, right? Because enrollments, I think he argued, at state colleges and universities are declining, so this bring more people in who'd be paying into the system. Am I getting that right?
Yes, and one thing about students that go to state institutions, they likely stay here. I went to Wellesley. I come from a mixed status family. The month I walked onto the campus of Wellesley, my father was deported. And so I know a lot about family separation and this immigration argument. But when you have 1 in 6 people in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts who are foreign born, this is an economic opportunity and an equity and racial justice issue. And I am, really excited to work with the chairman and Senate President because they both have been very vocal in support of this, and I believe most of my colleagues will be too.
So this, as you mentioned right at the beginning of this comment, this has been kicking around for a while. I think
20 years.
Former Governor Romney vetoed a budget section that would have done something similar 20 years ago. The House voted against it also about 20 years ago. Senate President Spilka, before she was Senate President Spilka, came out in favor of this idea again almost 2 decades ago. How likely is it this becomes a reality this session, do you think?
It's very likely. Senator Crichton and myself are working incredibly hard. And when you have 2 important people in the Senate supporting this already, I think most of my colleagues, maybe not all, but most of the Democratic colleagues, I think, will be in support of this because of the argument about the workforce challenges, about competitiveness. But for me, it's about equity and inclusion and the moral argument. And I think the combination of both make it a really successful amendment.
Jen, closing question for you. When the driver's license ballot question passed last year, it was about, I think, 8 percentage points, 54 to 46. Where do you think public opinion stands on this? And do you think, I mean, that's a terrible question to throw at you. Let me reframe it. Do you think that state lawmakers might be getting out ahead of public opinion when it comes to looking to carve out new benefits for some people who are undocumented?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball on hand. The thing that I would be pointing to is actually what the senator referenced is that this is a fairly popular policy nationwide. It might surprise people that Texas as a state loves it so much that they actually agreed to let students out of state who are not Texas residents pay in-state tuition requirements because they wanted to keep their in-state tuition requirements for undocumented students. So this isn't something that tends to actually break really hard along policy grounds. So I expect this might be a similar situation in Massachusetts.
And when you have 23 states and the District of Columbia, we don't want to be behind. Massachusetts tends to be a leader, tends to be #1, and we're falling behind on this.
I feel like any time that advocates can point out, we like to think of ourselves as leading, but we're falling behind, there's real
and we're
political
behind
power in
Texas.
that.
I mean, I don't think anyone wants to be behind Texas.
Go
All right,
straight for the
Senator
pride.
Liz Miranda, Jennifer Smith of Commonwealth, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
That's it for tonight, but do come back next week. And please tell us what you think. The email's talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. Or you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Reilly Adam. For now, thank you for watching, and good night.
On Masterpiece.